All right, so to be respectful of everyone's time, we can go ahead and get started. I am Kate Breman. I'm the Director of Environment Maryland. We're a statewide citizen-based advocacy group in Maryland. And Bridget and I started this series in April, and it has grown into what it is now. Originally, we wanted to create an opportunity for people to engage in conversation while we were all quarantined and staying safer at home. And then we also wanted to have this opportunity. So much of our work is around these issues in maybe a legislative way, or a way where we're thinking about these things that doesn't allow room to be purely celebratory and purely just learning. So Conservation Conversations was born. And at first it was Bridget and I saying, what do we want to learn about and what would be super cool? And it's still kind of that, but also now you all who join us every week and think it's cool too. So I'm incredibly excited about this week. I'm excited for you all to be joining us. I'm going to turn it to Bridget to do some of the logistics stuff and then to introduce our guests for today.
All right. Thanks, y'all, again for coming to Conservation Conversations. My name is Bridget Sanderson. I am the Director of Environment Missouri, based out of Kansas City, Missouri. I would just like to say we will go ahead and have a question and answer period at the end for the last 10 minutes. So throughout, if you have any questions and you are on the Zoom webinar, drop them in the Q&A portion in there, or if you're on the Facebook live stream, drop them in the comments section so we can get all of the information we need. So I'm really excited for this one as well. We thought it was a perfect month of December themed Conservation Conversations. So I'm going to turn it over to Ian and let him introduce himself and also our special guest today.
Awesome. Thanks, Bridget and Katie. I'm going to share my screen, and then everybody has to gut check me and make sure it works. And now I'm going to present. All look good? Oh. So welcome. Welcome to Conservation Conversations. We titled this Conserving the Caribou with Ray Entz. So I'm going to start by introducing Ray. So our guest, Ray, is the Director of Wildlife and Terrestrial Resources at the Kalispel Tribe of Indians Natural Research Department, where Ray has worked for 28 years. I'll skim a little bit of this, but from what I know, Ray has been working on-the-ground conservation, including caribou and grizzly bear recovery projects. And then a part that I can definitely not leave out is that Ray is attempting to catch all of the existing native trout species in their habitats in the US, which hopefully we can hear more about. So the reason we're all here is to find out, is it a caribou or a reindeer? Who knows? So the age-old question, can you identify which is the caribou and which is the reindeer? I'll give you 1 second, and they're the same. So caribou and reindeer are the same species, and that's Rangifer tarandus. And so while technically the species are called reindeer in Europe and caribou in North America, they also can be commonly confused, as we saw in Katie's sweater, with some other common animals, as they're all in the deer family, and that's white-tailed deer, elk, and moose. So back to caribou. Caribou are large species of deer that inhabit the northernmost parts of North America, Europe, and Asia. They live in tundra, boreal, and mountainous regions and live in herds that can number hundreds of thousands. Caribou are vitally important to the culture and heritage of indigenous tribes in North America and Eurasia. And about 5 to 6 subspecies of caribou live in North America, including the woodland caribou, which resides in the boreal forest, and the porcupine caribou that lives in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in Alaska. So a bit of fun facts. Caribou make the largest land migration on Earth. So one herd travels nearly 750 miles round trip each year. That's pretty incredible. Caribou have special enzymes in their stomach that allow them to break down lichen, which grows on old growth trees. And this is a critical food source for them during their winter. As Rita mentioned in the chat, both male and female caribou grow antlers. And Santa's reindeer first got their names, and this was just the 8th, this was before Rudolph, and they were in the early 19th century poem, "'Twas the Night Before Christmas." So here's the range of caribou in North America. Of particular note, here they're called, in the top left, are called Grant's caribou. They're also known as porcupine caribou, and those are the caribou that live in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. A little bit more information about that. The Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is a 1.5 million acre coastal refuge in Alaska, home to polar bears, wolves, muskox, caribou, and tons of other stuff. It's the cabin ground for the nearly 200,000 strong porcupine caribou herd. And the importance to our work that we do in our campaign work, President Trump is attempting to push through drilling in this area before he leaves office, and we're currently running a campaign trying to convince him to stop and to protect the area. So caribou face a number of threats, including habitat loss from mining and logging. Woodland caribou especially are losing their boreal forest homes at an alarming rate. They're losing about 1 million acres of boreal forest that is cut each year. And so I just wanted to throw in a little shout out to the 2 campaigns we run that does work with caribou. So the actions you can take to help protect these iconic species is you can submit a public comment on protecting the Arctic Refuge, and we'll have a little link for that at the end. And then my personal campaign that I work on is trying to get our toilet paper that we use in the US to use a lot less boreal forest fiber. So you can not buy toilet paper that's made from virgin boreal forest fiber, including Procter & Gamble's Charmin. So with that, that's all I got. So I'm going to turn it over to Ray. And once again, Ray, just shout, let me know about switching slides, anything you want to say. And without further ado.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I'm going to tell a story that's maybe not as happy and certainly doesn't involve 200,000 animals in a herd. To talk a little bit about the South Selkirk Mountain caribou and the efforts that the Kalispel tribe was part of to try and recover that population. So go ahead. So caribou, like Ian said, they range quite a drastic portion. Go ahead and change the slide. Woodland caribou are unique. They populate themselves in mountainous regions of the Rockies. They eat arboreal lichens, tree lichens, which they can only access in the wintertime. So their ability to survive in the winter is built on a reverse migration for most ungulates. They move upslope in the wintertime to high snowpack, and where they can access the tree lichens, which are fairly high on the tree. So go ahead. So this is just the South Mountain caribou halotype, unique genetic composition and behavioral patterns. Like I talked about, this is a map of both their historic and current range, with a little bit of detailed information about their most southern extent, which we can talk about a little bit. The 2 dark gray blobs at the bottom near the US are the 2 most southern herds that exist in the South Mountain ecotype. And that is on the left, the Selkirk herd, which we worked with, and on the right, the Purcell herd. Go ahead, Ian. This slide just zooms in on the US portion, and the yellow dots basically are historical observations, both through collaring efforts and just visual observations from the past. So these observations go quite a ways back into the 80s, 70s, and beyond. And you can see that they range pretty broadly outside of their described range. And you can see a yellow dot pretty far down in central Idaho, and some dots pretty far west in Washington into the Kettle Crest. So these critters roamed around quite a bit. And just like most wildlife, they don't really read the books we write about them and what they're supposed to do. So they're wildlife, and we like to keep the wild in wildlife. Go ahead, Ian. So specifically, the South Selkirk caribou population was listed as endangered in the mid-1980s, and since that point has undergone a significant amount of management input to to recover that population, including 2 herd augmentations from other South Mountain caribou populations in the mid and late 90s. And so if you follow this population line, you can see that there was a pretty significant drop in population in the late 90s and early 2000s. And that was due to a single cougar who had learned how to hunt caribou and was very effective. And he was termed Mr. Nasty. And it was a monumental effort to even discuss the possibility of removing that single animal to protect the South Selkirk Mountain caribou herd. Fortunately, a Canadian hunter successfully removed Mr. Nasty in 2002. And as you can see, we saw a very marked response to that removal of a single animal that had learned how to hunt caribou. We were on a trajectory to reach recovery in another decade. And we were seeing recruitment rates that surpassed what literature reports, and we were seeing anywhere from 17 to 20% recruitment each year in that rebound until 2008. Go ahead, Ian. So all of the South Mountain ecotype herds have been seeing marked decrease in population since the 90s. This, like Ian talked about, is due to a lot of factors, and most of them are habitat related, and then the spin-off effects of an abrupt habitat change. So the one thing you can note looking at this is that the South Selkirk herd, the most southern extent of this population, the one under the most stress from climate and snowpack, was doing really well until 2008. More so than any other herd in the South Selkirks. So go ahead, Ian. So why the population change? Well, there were some significant changes to predator-prey dynamics that started to rear their ugly little heads in the mid-2000s. That was coupled with, anthropogenic changes and development and changes to forests due to both past practices and climate. Go ahead, Ian. So the changing predator-prey dynamic is an interesting one to talk about. So as we've changed habitat, especially in a boreal forest, we've actually changed it to be more favorable to the other ungulates. And that's basically opened the door for those ungulates that are more low elevation adapted to start to move upslope and start to overlap with caribou who used an upslope migration in the winter to escape predation. They're not necessarily, that is their predatory escape mechanism, is to migrate into deep snow and avoid predators. They're not going to run from predators like other ungulates that evolved with that close predator-prey relationship. So this change in habitat sort of saw this overlap in elevation and bringing predators into closer proximity. And all the while, we had recovering wolf and grizzly bear populations in that very same area. Ian, go ahead. So this is probably the most telling data for the South Mountain caribou that we have, and that is wolves showed up in 2008. In times before that, they were transitory, they were moving through, they were establishing territories in other areas. They didn't establish in caribou habitat until 2008. Once they did, there was a precipitous decline in population, and it was unmistakable. It's easy to throw wolves under the bus and to get caught in that wolf trap in saying that this is really the wolf's fault. It's not. It's simply there was a whole bunch of stressors on this population of caribou. And although they were doing pretty well up until 2008, this additional source of stress was too much for that population. So, so the advent of wolves into their territory was just the straw that broke the caribou's back. Go ahead, Ian. So we had other critical threats for this area. This is that area between Idaho, lower BC, and Washington State, where these caribou lived out their life history. Go ahead, Ian. So one of the issues that I think is paramount is that this is snowpack in this area is unmatched, and so it brings a lot of potential winter activities associated with it that humans like to do. Those come at a time when animals like caribou and other ungulates are in severe stress, winter stress. Their diet now shifting exclusively to arboreal lichens. As you can probably tell, not the most nutrient-rich food source. So they're really hanging on. And so additional stresses and additional disturbances really having a severe effect on overwintering ungulates and especially caribou. So go ahead. Highway 3 and Kootenay Pass in Canada. Really kind of a linchpin problem for caribou and other animals in that area, especially bighorn sheep, which there's a population of in that area as well. They have to cross this east-west highway to range north and south in their range. And the interesting thing about Kootenay Pass is that with all the snowfall, it's a heavily salted highway and for safety reasons. And so it draws the ungulates to the highway for the minerals. And this picture is telling for caribou. So go ahead, Ian. And the third thing is sort of that human and climate induced habitat change, and that's that the increase in fire, both in size and in how often. We're seeing a lot of that in the Northwest. Logging and road construction have done their part in sort of amplifying that secondary prey interaction and the ability for predators to start moving into caribou habitat in the winter, where that was their natural way of managing predation. Ian, go ahead. So some of the things that we did in 2013, we engaged our state and federal partners in Canada to really start to implement a triage strategy with the South Selkirk caribou. We recognized that this population trend was not going to be sustainable, and if we wanted to maintain this culturally important species and one that is part of our shared natural heritage across all of our communities. It was the last caribou population in the lower 48. So we engaged them. We talked about these triage strategies. So we initially funded and helped fund Canada in a mortality study. We looked at wolf, temporary reductions of wolf populations in that recovery area, increasing signage on Highway 3 and protecting habitat. So go ahead, Ian. So in 2014, we funded Canada to put out 6 collars. When we got mortality signals, we would go out and investigate the source of mortality. And it was pretty evident that both wolves and vehicles were our primary problem. The 2 unknowns were categorized as unknowns, but they were basically vehicle strikes with a secondary predator finishing the job. Just a bruised and battered caribou is just not going to survive as long as a healthy one. And so those 2 were vehicle predators. So go ahead, Ian. So we also helped fund a wolf collaring and removal project. And between 2014 and 2017, we removed 25 wolves from that population to try to alleviate some of the sources of stress on the caribou, so that they had an opportunity to recover as they were before 2008. Go ahead, Ian. And then we worked closely with Canada to improve signage. This sign is at the bottom of Kootenay Pass on either side and alerts drivers to be mindful of caribou. We were working diligently to try to find granting opportunities to increase that signing to a collar activated signage much more close to the summit where caribou were seen, not 20 kilometers away, so that drivers could actually be more aware of the site potential for caribou being at risk on the highway. And we were unsuccessful in getting additional signage, but we never stopped. And then there's been several court and land management actions to do some habitat closures for winter recreation that overlap with caribou in that recovery area. Go ahead, Ian. And then about in this same time frame, the U.S. finally finished their critical habitat designation for caribou. Unfortunately, the proposal of 375,000 acres was reduced to just 35, and the 35 that was covered under the Samo Priest Wilderness Area in particular. So there was no broader extent of protection for caribou in parts of Idaho that were important to their survival. So a good thing, but not a great thing. Go ahead, Ian. And then Nature Conservancy Canada stepped up to the plate and purchased the Darkwoods property back in 2008 and protected an additional, I think it's 255,000 hectares, but comes up as acres, but it's a significant chunk of habitat. It's tied into some wildlife management areas in Canada and provincial parks. So it provides a larger area of protection. And that area in the Darkwoods was significantly used by the Selkirk herd in particular in the winter. Go ahead, Ian. So the last ditch effort, we're talking, it's 2017. Maternal penning has been tested in boreal herds for bridging neonatal mortality. We decided it was time to implement a maternity pen project for this herd to protect the neonatal caribou and to also give us an opportunity for a soft release site for potential future augmentations. So we could bring animals in from other herds, get them acclimated to that habitat type and animals from that herd so that they would soft release out and not just be kicked out of the back of the truck and say, hey, go make it. So the Kalispel tribe was able to secure funding to build and operate the Maternal Pen Project for a 3-year pilot program. And so in 2017, go ahead. Yeah. We selected a site with Nature Conservancy Canada on the Darkwoods property and went to making the maternal pen. Go ahead, Ian. So this is the site up in Darkwoods. It's pretty much at the top. It's at the headwaters of a creek. So it encompassed some meadows, some forested cover, and a creek. So there was good water access and enough room to move around. It was about an 18-acre site. Go ahead, Ian. And so we assembled a crew to go up and build this thing. And so this is basically a cable strung road filter fabric design where we tested this near Kootenay Pass about 3 years prior to see if it would withstand the winters, and they did really well. So we employed this design, and basically everybody I could muster out of our department helped build this thing for a week and we had help from two Canadian Ministry of Lands, Forests, and Natural Resource Operations Ministry, and one employee from the Kootenay Tribe of Idaho that helped us on that project. Go ahead. And so this is just a view of that 16-foot wide road filter fabric, basically strung across the trees, so that, you know, the snow can build up on that. And then in March, as the snow recedes, we would capture pregnant females, move them into the pen. They would be able to birth in the pen, be secure from predators. There would be caretakers up there basically walking the perimeter and making sure that we didn't have any Mr. Nasties get inside the pen and wreak havoc with our caribou. Go ahead, Ian. And this is where it gets a little sad. 2018, we had 160% snowpack. So it rendered the maternity pen completely inoperable. It overtopped the pen by March, which really put us at a point where we weren't going to be able to put caribou in it that spring anyway. But then we did the winter census, and during those flights, we were only able to locate one cow in the herd. So that last 7 of the last 8 animals at that point, we were basically really at the end, and we moved more rapidly to the end than we wanted to. So we engaged with Canada to make a pitch to move the last of the animals from the 2 southern herds to somewhere else where they could do some good and not just die on the landscape. So so we worked with them to move the Selkirk and Purcell herd, what was remaining of those herds, somewhere else. Go ahead, Ian. So we were able to do that. The last 5, 4 from the Purcells and 1 from the Selkirk, we were able to get moved to the Revelstoke herd. And the last data that we had from the collars before they went dead was that they were still alive and contributing to that herd. And right now, currently, efforts are underway in Canada to continue the restoration of caribou, and they're looking at captive breeding as an option, and that is it's getting a lot of traction, and we're getting closer. And then we have mystery caribou. So we have caribou showing up in Montana, right near Lake Kootenay, in habitat that is low elevation, not caribou habitat, beaten feet north. We weren't able to get collars on these guys to learn anything more, but Mr. Caribou show up. And then in 2019, that bull in the middle shows up on the Darkwoods property. So they're not gone. I didn't think they were gone. They're called the gray ghosts for a reason. They like to hide, and they're really good at it. And they're showing us that, again, we can write all the books in the world, but they don't read them, and they kind of just do their thing. And they're still there, probably at pretty low population, but our efforts today are really focused on that additional recovery effort. And so I just talked to my one of my biologists who's been heavily involved in these efforts, and I can give you an update on the current situation. We are currently cooperating with the Arrow Lakes Caribou Society to create another maternal pen for the Central Selkirk population. And this population is starting to show some recovery in recent years, although it is still in a downward trend since the 80s, but is now starting to show some improvement. We are also working with the Mackenzie herd and trying to develop a real-time web-based camera at the feeder at their maternity pen to generate awareness of caribou, and hopefully there will be a live stream by March. And maybe with any luck, we'll have some sort of an adopted caribou program that goes along with that to help fund that maternity pen and that herd recovery at the Mackenzie herd. And BC is moving ahead with the captive breeding facility, and we have been supporting that with the remaining funds that we have available. And we're waiting for a final plan. So that's kind of a update, and I'll leave it at that, and we can take questions.
All right. Thank you. That was incredible. I'm right now thinking about how to give all my life savings to adopt a caribou. You had me at adopt a caribou. So yeah, we're gonna take questions. If you're on the Zoom, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A. Facebook, you can put them in that chat. And so I see that we have one here. I have a couple that I can save till the end. Hopefully we'll have time. But a question from Rita: do the females typically have one offspring at a time?
Yes, it's very rare for mountain caribou to twin. One of the reasons why the population recruitment levels are below 15% naturally is because of their fecundity rate, and that, you know, you're looking at every other year for a calf as opposed to every year. So they're not as prolific a breeder as white-tailed deer or mule deer. So that's one of the problems, is that when you have a low recruitment reproductive rate animal like a caribou, and then you add in a predator that's a highly fecund predator like a wolf that can occupy a territory in literally 2 years, it puts an amount of stress on those animals that they're just not accustomed to. And considering they have habitat stresses and recreational stresses and highways built in the middle of their migration routes, there's only so much they can sort of endure, given all of that. So yeah, that's a tough one. And their fecundity is a direct relationship to how quickly they started to tank all across the entire South Mountain type.
That was really fascinating. I didn't know anything about caribou, so thank you so much for coming on, Ray. That was great. We have a question/comment from Joe. She said, very fascinating. Thank you. Can you describe the environmental benefits the caribou provide?
Well, caribou are an indicator. Just like a lot of very specialist types of animals, they're an indicator of our health, our environmental health. They occupy those high mountainous, high snowpack areas, and given that, they're a real good indicator for how we're getting along with climate change and other effects from that. So if caribou can't survive because of the changes in moisture patterns, and we get into a more moisture deficit situation, we're going to see things like bull trout not being as viable, grizzly bear not being as viable, because they rely on one another. And, the neonatal mortality I talked about is really bear related. So all of these animals, it's such an intricate web of interrelationship that, you can't tease them apart. But when you look at Canada putting into effect, large swaths of crown land that were absolutely off limits to logging for caribou, hundreds of thousands of hectares, the timber community was up in arms. That's a huge issue for Canada. They were able to sustain that, but their importance, I can speak to it from a tribal perspective. The Kalispel tribe used caribou to sustain themselves in the darkest of times in winter, when there was no more food left and the winters were long. They could rely on caribou as a source of protein at their darkest moments. And so the Kalispel tribes give back to caribou was to be there for them in their darkest moment. And so that's just part of, it's not just a natural connection, but it's also a cultural and a heritage connection that we all share.
I think that's such an important point there, and such a important frame of that interconnectedness. We have another question from Rita. Do people have domestic herds for any commercial reason in lieu of conservation?
Absolutely. Antler production is a big deal for various reasons. Elk are raised all the time for, both meat and for antler production. So caribou are not a stranger to that domestic kind of perspective. Not so much in this part of the country, but certainly in other parts of caribou habitat, there are domestic herds. And they're usually pretty heavily regulated.
All right, we've got another question from Len. I know they can't fly naturally, but do caribou ever get tamed and pull things like sleighs?
Yeah, actually, I was just in Michigan and was at a holiday festival, and they had 2 caribou on site that pulled a sleigh in, and they went into a corral basically for the kids to pet. But they can pull sleighs, and our caribou did fly, sometimes reluctantly with a helicopter helping, but.
Yeah, they flew from the area you were talking about up to Revelstoke, is that right? That was the journey?
Yep, they flew to Revelstoke.
Wow.
Yep.
I wanted to just ask Ian if you have questions. I know Bridget and I have been going back and forth on the chat, but I wanted to stop and take an opportunity. Ian, this was your idea. You were generous enough to put this together, so I just wanted to kick it to you for a second.
Sure, yeah. First, Ray, thank you so much for sharing, obviously, an incredibly heartbreaking story that's personal to you, but also just such a valuable story that needs to be told, and a story of extinction that we all need to hear at a time when a lot of that stuff weighs in the balance. I also want to say I was a ski instructor during that 2018 winter, and I remember how crazy snow it was. I was up in Washington, so I'm sure that really took a toll on the plans that you had. But I'm looking for some positive questions to help lighten it up. I'll start with what's your favorite memory or experience that you had working or researching or conserving caribou?
I think my favorite part of this is when we decided to shuck off the apathy that really clouded this particular herd and this particular part of our shared natural heritage. And we decided to lead. We have no jurisdiction, no authority, no legal responsibility, but we stepped up into the place and tried to lead by example. And so my favorite part of this is that our staff went all in. Our silviculturist, our fisheries habitat program manager, our state forest practices biologist, we all came together as a team. Our archaeologist went with us as well. We went in as a team to build that maternity pen in Canada, and we did it on our own. And it was hard because it seemed that those with the jurisdiction and the responsibility were overcome with apathy on this particular species, and I don't understand it. In the 80s, people were dancing in the streets of Spokane in caribou costumes to save this particular herd. And by the late 2000s, I think we participated in a dozen or more articles, both local and national and international, about caribou recovery. and we just couldn't beat the apathy. I think if people had been as excited about Caribou as they were in the 80s, we may not have failed.
I think that's a very powerful answer. Thank you. And thank you for sharing. And sorry, your slides got a little stretched, but I take full responsibility for it if anybody is nitpicking.
It happens. Technology problems, right? In the age of COVID.
I was gonna say it's the year 2020. It's okay. We do have another question from Joe, and I think that this is actually a little bit more directed towards you, Ian. Well, and also Ray. What can we do to help, and what are non-threatening toilet paper brands?
So there's a lot you can do. And the message I took to people when they said, what do we do? When we still had Caribou left to try to work with, was don't be silent. Call your congressional representatives, talk to the Fish and Wildlife Service, make them accountable for the responsibility that they have to this species. This was the last herd in the lower 48 of caribou. You can go to Canada and still see them. You can go to Alaska and see hundreds of thousands of caribou. This was the last of its kind. And we owe it to them and ourselves and what we do to have those pieces of our natural heritage exist for our grandchildren and for their children. To say that I've been in the wild and seen a mountain caribou, I can't share that with my with my grandkids. I can't, and that's kind of shameful. So don't be silent. Find good partners, like the Arrow Lakes Caribou Society, the International Caribou Society. We have on our Camas, our 501c3, I think it's the Camas Foundation. We do have an ability for giving for caribou. All the proceeds that we received from all of our fundraising and things that we did to try to build a bridge here are still being used to support these other efforts, whether it be in Revelstoke or Arrow Lakes or the McKinsey herds or the Central Selkirks. We're fully invested because recovery for all of those herds builds a source of strength that we can rely on to recover those southern habitats again before they disappear to logging or other uses. We need to double down and recover this South Mountain caribou ecotype so that we can get them back and someday maybe see them again in Washington or Idaho.
I'll jump in with a couple toilet paper brands. So we run a campaign to try and get U.S. tissue manufacturers to use less boreal forest fiber, which they use a ton of, and that contributes to a lot of logging in Canada, and that threatens the woodland caribou species that live up there. And Procter & Gamble is the target of our main campaign because they're a large tissue manufacturer, the largest, and they make Charmin. But some good brands to use, pardon my French, but Who Gives a Crap is it's an all recycled / sometimes bamboo, as well as Seventh Generation is a kind of a more US based brand. And I will send out a link. I personally use Who Gives a Crap, but that's personal. Oh, and then I guess I'll ask a quick question. So I know that the idea for the maternity pen was based off of other success that was happening in Canada. Is that success still continuing, and is that an option that's being employed widespread, or what's the status of it?
Say that again.
Oh, of the maternity pen strategy. Is that still being used in Canada?
Yeah, so Revelstoke had a maternity pen that they operated up until 2018. I'm not sure of the status on that, but they are now developing one for the Mackenzie herd and the Arrow Lakes. So yeah, I think it's an important tool. I'm not a big fan of captive breeding. If we make stupid caribou, they're really not going to repopulate. It is a way to build numbers, that is true. But if they're eating reindeer chow, they're not going to be smart enough to survive in the wild, in my opinion. And we got offered the opportunity to use the last of the Selkirk herd in a captive breeding, and we were very against it. And I think we probably stopped that from happening just because I think that wildlife need to stay wild. And it's probably a necessary evil tool that we have to use at this point, but I'm more backing the maternal penning temporary pieces. We can move caribou from herd to herd and maintain genetic diversity. We don't want genetic bottlenecking happening with these animals either. So having some genetic movement is going to be important, and maternal penning is really that soft release strategy to bring animals in, acclimate with locals, and move out into that habitat without just getting kicked out of a truck, because they tried that in 2010 and it failed miserably. So they tried to augment the Purcells in 10, and it was a hard release, and I think 0 survival. So we've been building some synergy around this. It really worked well with the boreal ecotypes that eat the ground lichens. So we translated that effort to the mountain caribou. And I think, Revelstoke had a couple of minor issues where they had, I think it was an avalanche or something, that killed a couple that went just as they left the pen. But for the most part, was really successful. It was able to give those calves that extra 2 months of 0 pressure and high quality food, just to bridge that neonatal gap. It was super important to, work on some of these minor points of stress, but overall increasing that recruitment rate, which is really important with a low fecund animal like that.
There's so much good stuff in there, and so much, I think, interesting about the way, like you mentioned, that we can write the books and they don't read them, and how the wild is wild, and we need to find ways to work with that instead of against it. A question in the chat: there's a movement to create more wildlife corridors, including bridges crossing highways across the country. Is that something that you think would help with that, with the situation for the caribou?
Yeah, it was one of our major initiatives kind of moving forward with that Highway 3 issue, was to somehow find a path forward. Those things are expensive. But if you've been to Banff, and if you haven't, go, because it's worth the trip. It's a beautiful place. But they spent millions and millions of dollars creating wildlife bridges all through Banff, so that they could, the amount of traffic that place gets is immense, and the amount of wildlife is immense. And so the vehicle strikes were out of control. And so they did a really good job of doing that, but at a cost. And of course, it kind of seemed like there wasn't a lot of synergy for that. And that was probably going to be our next major fundraising effort, was to try to raise enough money to build a wildlife crossing at Highway 3. And it's not just caribou. Like I mentioned, the bighorn sheep, we have a shared bighorn sheep population between that area and Washington. And, they're just getting sick of losing sheep to vehicle strikes. And so they almost asked if we'd take the sheep down to Washington. I don't think that's going to happen, but certainly a wildlife bridge is going to be beneficial to a multitude of species, especially considering that that highway is salted and it's a magnet for pulling animals down for minerals.
That's a good point. I didn't think about salting of the roads in that aspect because, you know, out here in Missouri, we also salt our roads quite a bit. And I always think about plants, but I didn't think about the fact that it's drawing, you know, animals to the roadways for nutrients. That's fascinating. I think we've got one more question and then we might wrap up just to be cognizant of your time, Ray. The last question is, are the caribou or reindeer in Europe having the same issues?
So I'm not following the European situation very closely, but if I remember correctly, this is kind of widespread. And it's really for these subspecies of caribou that are reliant on snowpack and elevation, the changes in precipitation are having a devastating impact on caribou. Not that it's, you know, it's not necessarily a death sentence. I mean, if you look at some of the climate modeling, that inland maritime rainforest, which the caribou interact with, in which is a really unique habitat type in the world, in BC and Washington and Idaho, that is one of the more climate resilient places on the planet. So if we're going to have things like bull trout, caribou, intermountain grizzly bears, those are the places where they're going to survive. They're probably the most resilient places we have left on the planet just by how they are juxtaposed in the world. So you know, climate doesn't have to be the end, but it might be the one place we can hang on to keep some of these really sensitive species that are kind of post-glacial species alive.
So there is one question we always end with, and I'm going to make sure that Ian gets a chance and Bridget get a chance to sort of say something at the end. But the question we always end with is, the people who generally watch conservation conversations are in the sphere of interest. And so, you know, we had the great question about toilet paper, but what do you want people to leave here with as far as what is, you know, in your mind, the number one and two things that people can do to help? And then I also was just going to ask if you can just repeat the name of the C3 that people can donate to. I can try to pull that link and put it in the chat so that people have it.
So it's it's the Kalispel Tribes Camas Institute is one of them. We have our 501c3, and the other one is the Arrow Lakes Caribou Society.
And then I guess the other part of that is just, what do you hope, what's the one thing you want people to take away today?
Well, I couldn't say it better than Jimmy V. Don't give up. Don't ever give up. So do what you can. If giving money is important, you can do that. There's places that will put that money to good use. If you want to give your voice a shot, do it. If you want to change your toilet paper brand, do that. Every little bit helps. And if we let apathy grip us because it's too late, or there's too few, or it's too hard, then we're not going to be part of this environment for much longer either. Because when it stops sustaining the wildlife, eventually it's going to stop sustaining us. And so as stewards of this world, we have a responsibility to do what we can. So don't give up.
That's so wonderful. A great note to end on an otherwise kind of depressing conversation. But I appreciate everything that you do for work and you know, everything helping out with the caribou as well. So Ian, I'm going to let you go ahead if you need to make some announcements, and then Kate and I can kind of wrap it up.
Thank you, Ray. I'm not going to give up, and I don't think any of us will. So we'll try and hold on as long as we can. I just wanted to also just one of also our campaign that we're actually looking for public comments for stopping Arctic drilling, which is the calving grounds of the porcupine caribou herd. So I just want to drop that link. It's an easy sign on. Oh, sorry, I just sent it to Kate. Let me send it to everybody, or if Kate can post it.
I'll post it, and I'll put in a public comment too, because I'm not giving up either.
Perfect. Thank you. Yep, other than that, thank you, Ray, and thank you, Katie, and thank you, Bridget, and thank you for everybody for joining.
Thank you, everyone, so much.
Welcome. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, if you like all of the work that we're doing, definitely consider giving a donation. Kate and I put in the links to the foundations that Ray has been talking about. Consider also donating to Environment America, Environment Missouri, and Environment Maryland. A completely unrelated discussion, but I'm going to do a little shout out. Kate and I will be hosting another webinar tomorrow. It is not conservation conversations, but it is around one of our newest reports Environment America put out about green stormwater infrastructure. It is tomorrow at 2:30, so definitely hop on and learn about how we can try to get a path to cleaner water. Hop on the Environment America Facebook, because we will be live streaming. So again, Ray, thank you so much, and thank you everybody for coming. Kate, do you have anything else to add?
I'm going to keep an eye on this Adopt a Caribou situation. And as soon as we know more, I will put that out on all of our social media so that everyone who's here today, whenever that happens, Ray, I am your '1 fan, and we'll blast it to our email list and to our social media.
That is the Mackenzie herd, and I'm not sure who's connected to that, but we can find out. So ping me in, and I'll transmit any of that information to you guys that I can.
Great. Well, thank you all again. Thank you so much for being here. Again, reminder, these are monthly now. And so we will see you next time.
All right. Merry Christmas, everybody.
Yeah, you too. Thank you so much.